Okay, it says it's recording. Okay, welcome to The Uprising is Here, brought to you by XYZ Creative, a podcast about news, culture, history, and current events from the perspective of a transgender man. Today we have special guest Zoe Playdon, who is a emeritus professor at the University of London and also the author of The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes and The Unwritten History of the Trans Experience, which is an excellent book and you should go buy it. Um, it will be in my Amazon storefront at www.amazon.com/ The Uprising is Here, and it will be under episode 2, and it should be the first book. So I would recommend going and reading that after you listen to the podcast. So how are you this morning, Zoe?
I'm fine, thank you. And you?
Doing excellent. I know it's 7 a.m. here and noon where you are. So
That's right. I'm in London, England. It's
yep, and
raining.
it's raining.
It's bank holiday, so of course it rains. Yes, that's an English tradition.
Yeah, I think it's been raining all April, so hopefully today we get sun.
Wow.
Um, I'm in Detroit, Michigan for all those listening. So we're in different time zones. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to ask you about was the background of you and Forbes. And that's how you say it, right? Forbes?
It is, yes, correct.
Okay, I wanted to
Yes,
make sure for my
okay.
American self.
No, absolutely. Got to get these things right. Hardly anyone knows that until the 1960s, British trans people self-identified, accessed affirmative medical care, corrected their natal birth certificates, and lived in complete legal equality. And then suddenly that ended. Natal birth certificates couldn't be corrected, trans civil liberties were removed, a new, very brutal psychiatric NHS medical regime replaced the affirmative model, and socially trans people were ostracised. Um, and so from that point onwards, trans survival, or being trans, meant surviving, and survival meant self-censorship and assimilation. And no one knew why this had happened. Then suddenly I was tipped off by a retired lawyer about a legal case that had been the tipping point for this change. All traces of the case had been removed from the public eye, he said, and everyone who knew about it had been sworn to secrecy because, he said, and I quote him here, there are some interests that it's more important to protect than the rights of individuals. So from the point of this hidden legal case onwards, trans people would have to live their lives as if they were the sex incorrectly assigned at birth and suffer the devastating legal, social, and psychological consequences of that. Well, obviously, you try to avoid conspiracy theory, absolutely. But as it turned out, the tip-off was right. This was the hidden case of Ewan Forbes, and it took me 2 years and the direct intervention of the Home Secretary to get the case papers revealed. So then I wrote the book, which tells Ewan's story in the context of trans history from the 1980s to the present day. I wanted to evidence the fact that all trans people were equal before this case. I wanted to show how it was removed, and I wanted to demonstrate the ongoing work of UK and US, for that matter, trans people and their allies to reclaim civil liberties that were removed. And this is a big difference between trans and LG. LG are often looking for civil liberties they didn't have before, like equal marriage. Trans people are looking for civil liberties they had and that were removed.
Yeah, definitely. So with Ewan, according to the book, he's born in 1912. So he obviously he would have been growing up in the 20s.
Yeah.
And yeah, in the book, it talks about him going to Europe for various treatments. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Medically, we get the first diagnostic criteria for being trans, turning up in 1896 when a psychiatrist, Richard von Krafft-Ebing, writes a book called Sexualis, Psychopathia Sexualis. He's writing it for the law courts. The law has to decide who to prosecute for being sexually inappropriate and who not to. trans people get a pass, a complete legal pass. Krafft-Ebing defines being trans as what we would now call a diversity of sex development, an intersex condition. And he called it metamorphosis sexualis. And provided you followed his patient narrative, then provided what you told the doctor matched the criteria that Krafft-Ebing gave, then you were fine. You got a free pass. I mean, one of the most famous people who did that was Lily Elbe, whose book, at least a biography, Man into Woman, is a kind of a guidebook to those who know this is what to say, this is what to do, this is what you mustn't do, you know? And Lily Albe's narrative is matching Krafft-Ebing's. More famously perhaps, Christine Jorgensen went on to give just exactly the same narrative and more or less got through the medical hurdles. If you didn't give the right narrative, then you were going to get treatment. But certainly, especially from the 1900s onwards, there was a lot of interest in hormones as a new medical specialty. And by the 1920s, hormones were being synthesized, they were available for treatment, and most of this work was going on in Europe. Very little of this work went on in the US, in fact. And Ewan's mother, and we must remember he came from a very wealthy and hugely well-connected and influential family. Ewan's mother took him on a tour, more or less, of the research facilities in different European countries that were doing this, and he was, in effect, a guinea pig for early testosterone when he was a kid. So he didn't go through the wrong puberty. That meant that he could live his life relatively freely, and certainly by 1952, he fell in love. He corrected his birth certificate. Everyone could. And provided you got access to medical care and so on. Over here, we don't have the NHS until 1948. So, it was very much about money. But provided you got access to medical care, in England, you just took one letter from one doctor to the General Registry Office, and they corrected your birth certificate to Department D6, and that was where that was done. And we have lots of people, especially men, correcting their birth certificates. A man called Winsley Swan in 1927, Mark Weston, the international athlete, in 1936, a guy called Robert Allen, who wrote his biography in 1944, famously Michael Dillon in 1948, and of course Ewan himself in 1952, and hundreds more. But they're hidden because unless there was a reason to report it, which is maybe some sort of legal case or an employment issue or something, unless it got reported in the press, nobody knew. Why would they? Why would anybody care? It was that person's own private medical history and personal business, and it was uncontested. So for a long period, there was affirmative and elective medical care. Ewan had cross-sex hormones. He chose not to have any reconstructive surgery. And, it was absolutely your choice. And as I say, full legal equality. And hundreds of people that are going through this, this patient pathway and legal route.
So after I read this book, I wanted to talk about like the narrative today versus this book about how being trans is new and it's just been medicalized, which is obviously untrue, starting with Krafft-Ebing, as you said, in 1896. So having said that, is there any prior history to 1896 medically, or is that just where it kind of begins on paper?
Well, that's where it begins on paper. And the reason it begins on paper in Europe and certainly in the UK is certainly for Britain. In the late 1880s, we have the British Empire starting to collapse. And I mean, we already had it collapsing, of course, when the US did its Declaration of Independence. And since then, everyone else quite wisely followed suit. So we have empire collapsing, and we have a huge amount of anxiety about the fitness of the British population to rule. And this means that the imperial eye, the colonial eye, turns inwards on its own citizenry and starts to ask questions about them, exactly the same kind of awful derogatory questions that were asked about people who were colonized, with the same eugenic intention. And in particular, there was an attack on gay men who were seen as diseased or degenerate. And uh, by 1896, gay men had been criminalized. And therefore, the courts wanted to know, and there was a general similar ripple movement across Europe, more or less at the same time of criminalizing gay men. And so the court wanted to know, how do you know whether they're a criminal or not, and who decides? And this is where early psychiatry, again, that period, was trying to make a name for itself as a science and to give itself authority. Because frankly, at that point, people thought it was just nonsense. Now, this was Freud's big issue with Carl Jung, was, he said, we've just simply got to establish ourselves as a proper science. Because, so for example, Arthur Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes author, he was very interested in spiritualism and doing table tapping and Ouija boards and manifestations and so on. And at that point, spiritualism was seen as being a very respectable and scientifically based activity, while psychiatry was seen as being absolutely, charlatans and rogues and complete nonsense. So psychiatry was anxious to formalize itself into a proper scientific medical specialty. And the early psychiatrists leapt forward like Krafft-Ebing to say, we're the people who can tell you. We can tell whether they're diseased and degenerate or not, basically. And that was what Krafft-Ebing was writing for. He was writing for the criminal courts. So it's at that point, really, that we see medicine coming into its own. Of course, we'd had trans people for hundreds of years, both imagined in the early 7th century, for example, in Europe. We have this big thing about monsters and the Book of Monsters, supposed beings that exist in different places. We have a very famous map for those of your viewers who are likely to visit Britain. If you go to Hereford Cathedral, then you'll see the Mappa Mundi there, which is a very early map, a fantasy map really, of the world. And it has all sorts of monsters on there, people with men with the heads of dogs and people with just one leg and one huge foot and so on and so forth. Amongst those monsters were people who were half male and half female. And early anthropologists included in their monster category people who changed their sex. So the notion of trans has been with us, just like the notion of intersex has been with us for a long, long time. If we want to go all the way back, then we would go back to Mesopotamia, and we'd go back to the Sumerian hymn, The Descent of Inanna, which describes these little creatures, the Galai, that are neither male nor female, but they're a mixture of both. They're non-binary. And we can note too that Milton said that, the angels in Paradise Lost, he says that the angels are non-binary too. He doesn't use that term, but they're both male and female. And the church fathers believed that Christ at his ascension was neither or both male and female. So the idea of trans had always been about. It was the point at which gay men were criminalized that there was a need to make a strong distinction between trans and gay, especially between trans women and gay men. And so this is where medicine steps in and says, we can do the job. And this is where Kraft-Ebing creates this astonishing and absurd draft criteria, which nevertheless, still pertain. It's part of it is still used. You'll find them still being used by medicine today.
What I found interesting in the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that I think it stated that medical textbooks before psychology, before like John Money and everyone got involved, had treated it as an intersex condition. Is that true?
Yeah. Yes, yes, yes. Right the way up until John Money and John and Joan Hampson did what they did, created this new fantasy pseudo-medicine of their own and called it gender. Um, right up until this, the medical invention of medical gender rather than, the term that we know now as part of cultural theory. Right up until then, it was an intersex condition. It was a natural diversity of sex development. And all of the authorities in the field, notably, of course, Magnus Hirschfeld, who opened his Institute for Sexual Sciences in Berlin in 1919, I think. Hirschfeld opens his institute. So people like Hirschfeld, I mean, really everyone saw being trans as an intersex condition. Over here in the UK, the prime person was a surgeon called Lennox Foster, and he talked especially about virilism, in other words, about trans men. And he had his clinic at Charing Cross Hospital, and there was an endocrinologist there who worked with him, and he had hundreds of people turn up and request treatment and get it, and then correct their birth certificates and live otherwise unremarkable lives. So, yeah, that was very much a big thing at that time. One of the interesting things about that period was visibility. So for Lennox Foster, it was very usual to find trans men. He said there were hardly any trans women. And yeah, he said he didn't see many trans women at all, but trans men, there were lots. And this was partly because of this theory of his of virilism, which, I will just mention because it is bizarre. So the virilism theory was sort of based on Darwinian development of the species. The idea is that a species develops towards the best and the fittest form, and that since the best and the fittest form of humans is men, naturally some women would start to develop and become men automatically. And this hence explained the preponderance of trans men over trans women. Really, all we're talking about is absence of any kind of public health data or data collection about this. But it's sort of an interesting thing to bear in mind when at the moment there's a lot of angst that there's lots and lots and lots of trans boys, and now they're in the majority, and and so on and so forth. And people are saying, and it's never been like this before. And I'm saying, well, you'd think, wouldn't you? But actually, if we just go back to the 30s, it was like this before. It's just what's visible. It's just what comes to the public notice. And it's just the presence or absence of data. But yeah, up until Money and Hampson's start their thing in 1955, trans is intersex. And then they begin this project to reclassify being trans into the same category of mental illness as lesbians and gay men.
Okay, speaking of data, before we move on to any more of Ewan's life, Magnus Hirschfeld's institute was burned by the Nazis. Um, in the when they took power. So we lost a lot of that data. I did want to ask you your thoughts because people like J.K. Rowling and some other people have now denied that transgender people were targeted at that time, and I wanted to know what your thoughts were on the loss of that data and what happened there.
Yes, the 6th of May, 1933, was the dark day when Hirschfeld's, both his private house and the institute, were ransacked, and thousands and thousands of medical records and other data, photographs and so on, were burned. Really very, very dreadful. And it was a great loss. Of course, a lot was lost. A lot of medical records were lost in the Second World War. A lot of specialisms were lost because, medicine, like every other industry, turned its focus onto the military. Um, but there's no question. I mean, certainly trans people were part of the general persecution. Typically, though, of course, at that point, we don't really have the word trans, you know? Yeah. What we have are people who are medically intersexed, but the Nazis weren't really terribly interested in medical classification. Um, and so trans women were classified as in the same category as gay men, given the pink triangle. Trans men were classified in the same category as trans men, as lesbians. Trans men were classified as lesbians and given the black triangle as, socially inappropriate. Both groups were sent not to gas chambers, but to death camps where you were worked to death. So you were given very little food, huge amounts of work. Certainly the trans women and the gay men got the very worst end of things in those camps. I mean, there's an awful lot of research. I understand that people might wish to deny these things, but at the end of the day, history, rather like nature, is one of those things that you can drive out with a pitchfork, but it will return because we have the documented evidence. Um, so, of course, one can deny it, but the historical evidence is, yes, trans women and gay men equally were treated very, very brutally. They had typically perhaps a 6-week period of life before they were literally worked to death. And trans women, trans men and lesbians were equally put into enforced labor in camps.
Which is terrible, yeah. And I think denying that is just like you said, it's going to come back. It's documented.
Well, there it is. I mean, these are the facts, and all one can say is, I understand. I think when we look at deniers, I'm beginning to think that it might be important to make a distinction between trans hate and transphobia, and that it might be useful to start thinking about transphobia in the same way that we think about other phobias like claustrophobia, you know, as an irrational response to something based on negative experiences in one's own past. Um, and I think that when we look at, J.K. Rowling's narrative, for example, she's written, I mean, very frankly and very painfully about her own dreadful experiences and the abuse that she's experienced. And I think there we might wonder whether what's going on is her trying to deal, really not dealing with those experiences and projecting them onto trans people, so that rather than have to think about and deal with the negative experiences yourself, you locate them in a third party elsewhere and feel that if you could only get rid of those people, everything would be okay. Um, and I think that's very, very, it's very, very sad. It is also very treatable. This is where psychotherapy comes into its own, really, to deal with this sort of irrational phobic response. And I think that's different from trans hate, which I would think of as being much more like racism, you know, a completely unsupported assertion of a series of aggressive views that are irrational and, in any event, untrue. And I think, yes, there is an awful lot of trans hate and there is some transphobia. And I think they're just starting to ask the question, why do you feel like this? You know, why are you saying these things? What does this mean for you? What would it mean for you if there were no trans people ever anymore? Because, you know, it's important just to recognize whether you're a hater or whether you're phobic, that that's not going to happen because trans people have always been here. I also think it's really helpful. I think this is where history plays a really useful part, because there's a sense that this is all new. And I think you see that on some of the trans hate websites, that this is all new and it's all been invented and it's all the internet and social media and so on. Well, of course it isn't. And in terms of the just trying to bring people down to earth, if we just simply say, okay, we are aware that there is a huge amount of violence against women, but statistically, who are the perpetrators? Because I think you'll find that they're cishet men. And we are aware that there's a huge amount of child abuse, but again, statistically, who are the perpetrators? Because I think you'll find that those two are cishet couples. And we know that there is often awful violence in prisons, and that's a whole different topic, really, and quite a difficult one because of the way in which it's reported or really not reported and managed. But again, if we can just check out statistically who's doing this, and as soon as we ask the question, who is doing this? Then, and if we say, well, most of the perpetrators tend to be cishet people and many of them tend to be male, then we might start to understand whose advantage is being served in blaming trans people for absolutely everything, including almost certainly global warming, you know.
Definitely. And yeah, all of society's ills. So,
Mm.
all right. Well, having said that, which is, a very good way to think about it, transphobia versus trans hate, I'll definitely take that with me. Um, I wanted to go back to, was it 1952 that Ewan changed his birth certificate?
1952, he falls in love and wants to get married. And to do that, he has to correct his birth certificate. Now, he hasn't corrected his birth certificate up till now because all of this wonderful treatment that he got, came at a price. Remember, his family is terribly well connected. Mum's a friend of the Queen, father's aide de camp to the King, granddad used to be an intimate friend of Queen Victoria, and so on and so forth. This means they've got a social role that they have to keep up. And the rules for that are very, very strict, and his father, especially, is a stickler for them. And what it meant for Ewan, really devastatingly, was that on public occasions, he had to dress up as a girl, even to the extent that he had to come out as a debutante in the London season because that was what was required of your position. That was what you did. And yes, of course, there will have been lots of amelioration of that within the family, where people say, well, this is what we all have to do, things that we don't like, Um, when the Queen's crowned, when Queen Elizabeth II is crowned, then people have to dress up in robes and do coronets and all sorts, and it's all very annoying and irritating and gets in the way. We all have to do this, Ewan, is what they would say. But nevertheless, of course, psychologically, it must have been damaging to him. And he doesn't want to upset the family because they're a very, many ways, a very close family in a very small community. And so he waits until his parents are both dead before he corrects his birth certificate. But he wants to marry Patty, and so he corrects his birth certificate, and they get married. And that's it. And would have lived happily ever after. Ewan was a local doctor, a family doctor in his local town of Arford. Um, he wasn't at all bothered about being aristocratic. As soon as he got his medical degree, he dropped the title that he had, which was the Honourable, and just became doctor. And that was a title that he liked, the one that he'd earned, not the one he'd been born with. And he was a local doctor. He bought a little estate at a place called Brooks, a very pretty, nice estate, 3,000 acres. I think the family estate was huge, 20,000 acres, 25 miles across, you know. His was small and it was what he wanted. And so he did the doctoring and he looked after the estate. And he and Patty were looking as though they were going to live happily ever after until disaster struck.
And what was that disaster? What happened to Ewan?
On the 31st of December 1965, his older brother, William, died. Now, William had two titles. I'm sure, again, your viewers who are familiar with The Crown or Downton Abbey will be au fait with this. But essentially, the family had two titles. One was a barony, which gives you the title Lord, and the other was a baronetcy, which gives you the title Sir. So the barony could go down the female line, but the baronetcy, the Sir, could only be inherited by the next male in line. This is one of the many weird medieval hangovers that we have in the UK in our legal and governmental system. A law called primogeniture, male line primogeniture, which says, it still says, by the way, it's still in effect, it still says that certain titles and estates can only be inherited by a man and never, ever by a woman. Now, I know that that defies every piece of sex discrimination law that you think we'd have, but if you look at any of our sex discrimination law, all of it says everyone is equal, except some people are more equal than others. And those are the people with primogeniture titles. And there have been 6 attempts in 7 years to overturn that, 6 different bills entered into Parliament to overturn primogeniture. They've all been squashed immediately. So there we are. This is what Ewan was up against. Now, Ewan had corrected his birth certificate, so he was legally male. There should have been no question but that he was the next person in line. But 2 things had happened since he and Patty got married. One of them was a cousin turning up and saying to Ewan, I'm going to put in for the title on the grounds that you're not a real man. The other thing, much more devastatingly, was John Money and the Hampsons and their effects in the US on medical interpretation and medical classification of trans people. And that was, remember, Ewan's a doctor, he knows the score, he knows what's going on. That was the clincher for Ewan, that was his big problem. When he corrected his birth certificate, being trans was an intersex condition. Now he's being challenged for the title. Money and Robert Stoller and Richard Green and the whole crew of them had successfully reclassified being trans as a mental illness. Medically, now, Ewan is female. Medically, his is a lesbian marriage. Medically, that means, legally, that means it's illegal. He and Patty, if they're classified, if Ewan's classified as female, then he and Patty are due 2 years imprisonment for perjury and the loss of everything.
Yeah, wow, that's definitely scary for Ewan, as I got from the book. And so the cousin turns up and then challenges him on it. And then what happens after that? And didn't his sister get involved?
Oh, yes. You see, Ewan should have been home and dry. You know, obviously, under those circumstances, you're going to be sitting there thinking about, well, where are we? What can he do? Can he really do anything? He can't really do anything, can he? Because your birth certificate and da-di-da. But Ewan's got a sister, Margaret, and they're estranged. She's a very difficult woman. She's estranged from almost everyone. And she's in financial difficulty. She bred horses, and that's not, it's a notoriously financially difficult area to work in. She's in financial difficulties, and her cousin John says to her, if you'll write me a letter saying that to your absolute knowledge, Ewan was and is and always has been female, then I'll give you 10,000 quid or I'll pay your debts. And Margaret does this. Now, this is quite astonishing. I mean, you've got to think, this is such a big breach of family trust and family confidentiality. And if it hadn't been for that letter, then Ewan would have been home and dry. So he thinks he is home and dry. First of all, Ewan's first strategy is to try to buy John off, our cousin John. Although the title can't be passed on to anyone, it's got to go to the next male in line and only to the next male in line, the estate can be transferred. So Ewan transfers a 20,000-acre estate together with all of the family jewels and paintings and a library that includes, first folios of Shakespeare and the whole thing. He transfers all of that to John with the gentleman's understanding that John won't go for the baronetcy. Now, Ewan can make the transfer of land and property. He can do that legally. That's a legal bill of transfer, no problem. But he can't hold John under any legal means to not going for the baronetcy. Because again, one of the oddities of the system is you don't decide. It isn't the family who decides who gets the baronetcy. It's a bod called the Lord Lion at the Lions Court in Edinburgh. And it's the Lord Lion who tells you what you've inherited in terms of titles and what your arms may be and what name you've got to call yourself now. And whatever the Lord Lion says, you have to do. So the most that Ewan could get from John was a gentleman's agreement that in return for the estates, John wouldn't go for the title. But of course, John was no gentleman. He went for the title anyway. As soon as John's gone for the title, Ewan's got to go for it, because not to contest it would be an implicit statement that Ewan wasn't eligible and was female. So he's
So he
done
had no
what
choice.
He has no choice. No, he has no choice in any of this. So he goes for the title. Then he finds out that his sister has written this letter, gets in touch with her immediately. They reconcile. Ewan explains to her just how things are. And it seems almost as though she sets up a bit of a bidding war between him and John. She goes and sees her cousin John and says to John, well, look, I've reconciled now with Ewan, and I think he probably is my brother, and so on. And she says to Ewan, well, I've said to John, if he does insist on going to court, it's got to be done in private, because, I don't want the whole family dragging into it. I think it dawned on her, Margaret was a lesbian herself, and I think it dawned on her that if Ewan was dragged into the public eye, she and her partner Joan probably would be dragged into the public eye too. And so it looks now as though it's going to be okay for Ewan, because, once he's got Margaret on side, then in court, all Margaret's got to do is to stand up and say, oh, well, cousin John paid me to write the letter and he told me what to put in it, and, I needed the money and I didn't really understand what it was all about, to be perfectly honest. And I am really very sorry that I wrote it. And now I do think that Ewan is my brother. And so she could say all of that in court and John's case would be shattered. So it was very unfortunate that one evening, driving down to see Ewan in her Land Rover uh, for dinner at his place at Brucks. This is a road that's usually empty. I've driven it myself many times, and it's always been empty. Um, and it will have been less so back in the 60s. Um, Driving down to for dinner with Ewan, there's a point where there's a bit of a bend and a little humpback bridge, and it's going downhill, and there's a junction all in one place. Exactly at that point, suddenly there was a lorry and a car. She could take no evasive action, there was nowhere to go. The lorry went into the Land Rover, and Margaret was killed.
Yeah, and she lost her life, so that definitely affected Ewan's case then.
Oh, yeah, very much so. Because now John had the letter and there was no Margaret to withdraw the testimony. So, he could make much of that. Meanwhile, we've got uh, especially John Money and Richard Green. Um, I should just say that John Money in 1955 starts to invent the idea of gender identity. This is where it's all coming from. Um, and he's trying to solve a very particular problem. The problem is that intersexed neonates, kids who are born with unusual genital formations, were, and still are for that matter, habitually corrected at birth, more or less, by surgeons. And surgeons have this problem. What if they corrected them into the wrong sex? Because it's much easier to correct into the female sex than into the male. And what if they got it wrong? Would they be sued? Basically, it's a legal question. Money and Hampton say, no, no, it's all right because sex is a matter of nurture, not of nature. And they invented the idea of appropriate gendered rearing and of a gender gate that if with proper parenting, you will be able to get kids through the gender gate that's supposedly swinging somewhere to and fro. They'd get through it on the right side, and then they would be cisgendered and heteronormative. Um, and Money then goes on notoriously to uh, try out this on a guy called David Reimer and to falsify his research about David Reimer to prove his case. But that falsification wasn't found out till 1997. In where we are now, in the late 1960s, this is now the thing, uh, that if a kid is trans or gay or lesbian, then it's the fault of the parents, almost certainly the mother, for parenting them badly. And it's Robert Stoller who then finds the first solution to that in 1962. He opens the first gender identity clinic at UCLA to cure um, uh, sissy boys and sissy girls and tomboys, as Richard Green liked to call them. After 2 years, it's not LGBT people that UCLA is treating, it's almost entirely trans people, curing them with a whole range of different methods. And this becomes a bit of a craze. There's a turf war. There's an excellent book by Jan Meyerowitz called How Sex Changed, which gives you all of the info on this. There's a turf war between endocrinology and psychiatry. Old endocrinologist Harry Benjamin is an old man now. He's not up to the fight. He's always thought trans was an intersex condition. He's always treated it like that. But he's just ridden over by Money and Green and Stoller and everyone else who's happy to jump on this new bandwagon and to say we can cure trans people with what we would now call conversion practices. Ewan knows this is going on, and he almost certainly knows not only has this been happening in the US, but it's about to be imported into the UK. Because Richard Green came over to the UK for a year as an intern at Charing Cross Hospital, and he met there a psychiatrist called John Randall. And John Randall was busy taking over the trans practice so that all the patients who thought they were coming to Charing Cross to see Lennox Broster, the affirmative surgeon, suddenly found themselves instead seeing this guy, John Randall, and being treated as mentally ill in a very, very brutal NHS regime. So Green and Randall put their heads together and decide to import the US model into the UK and to take over the NHS. And they formally do this in 1969, July 1969, the first international symposium on gender identity at the Piccadilly Hotel in London. And that's where the takeover bit happens. And you can actually hear 2/3, the last tape has been lost, of the proceedings. It's the University of Southern California that's got them in their trans repository. They've got recordings of it. It's a very shocking thing. It was, it was a takeover bid, and Ewan will have had his ear to the ground. He'll have known that this was in the air. He'll have known that this was about to happen. And he'll have known that in court, that's what's going to be said. So he has to find a strategy.
And well, what was that strategy? What did Ewan resort to there?
Well, it's a difficult thing. I think what we have to think of is the reason why he's doing this. Right? His back is entirely against the wall. He and Patty are going to lose their lives. They're both going to go to prison unless he does something that demonstrates absolutely that he can't be reclassified as mentally ill. Still worse, of course, he's a doctor. He knows this is a lie. He knows that the idea of being trans as a psychosis is supposed to be a florid psychosis in which you're rabidly mentally ill in just one area of your life. In everything else, in the whole of the rest of your life, you function completely perfectly. But there's just this one area where, and it is exactly the same narrative, we just need to know, that was used for gay men and lesbians. That everywhere else they can be all sorts of things, barristers and doctors and all sorts, prime ministers even, but in that one area, they're completely bonkers because they think that being gay is okay. So he knows it's a lie. And he determines he's not going to live within that lie. There's a really powerful essay by Václav Havel, the Czech Prime Minister, in the 1968 Spring Uprising in Prague, called The Power of the Powerless, in which Havel talks about the refusal to live within the lie and the way in which it can be countered. And Ewan decided to counter it. He effectively falsified medical evidence for court to demonstrate that he was intersexed rather than trans. This was very lucky for him. He's using medical samples that he claims are his own. Luckily for him, this is before we have DNA profiling. Otherwise, it'd have been done for. But even though everyone in court knows the evidence is false, even though his own medical authorities, who are witnesses for him in court, say that he's trans, and he very obviously is, there's nothing the judge can do. The judge has to decide that he is in fact an hermaphrodite with a male psychological disposition. And so Ewan wins his case. He's not free and home. He's just won his legal case. He punishes himself for it. He's haunted really by this for the rest of his life. And the punishment he does is he deregisters himself as a doctor. He knows he's committed gross professional misconduct. And even though no one can prove it, he knows it, and so does every other doctor in the court. So he takes himself off the medical register and gives up the title that he'd always wanted, and instead takes on, because he has no choice, the title of Sir. Now he's Sir Ewan Forbes of Craigavon. Ewan's also deeply religious and quite a fundamentalist form of religion. He's an Episcopalian, which is very literal, very hard-line Protestant group. And he's committed perjury. He's literally lied in the face of God. And this haunts him too. And he falls to his knees in the fields and prays for his soul, because he's overcome by remorse for having done this. And he has PTSD. If we read what was happening and listen to the people, as I have done, who knew him and told me what he was like, he's still remembered and very, very well respected in his hometown of Arford. Everyone, lots of people there remember the doctor, as they always call him. And he was lovely. He was a lovely doctor. He was lovely to everyone. People adored him. But for him, he was haunted. He found it then very difficult to make social contact with other people. He would ruminate. He had the thing, one of the PTSD symptoms is rumination, where you're continually going over the same repetitive idea again and again and again. And he would do that. He became hypervigilant, so that he'd spy on his employees on the estate, sit on the hillside with a pair of binoculars to see were they doing what they were supposed to. And he was a wreck, really. It ruined his and Patty's lives. And it ruined the lives of all other UK trans people, and eventually of trans people globally.
So my understanding is after Ewan's case, it was sealed, and then no other trans people could change their birth certificates for decades and decades. Is it true that you still can't do that?
It's still true. It's true that you still can't correct your natal birth certificate. Yes.
Wow. So still
You
to
can
this
be
day.
given. Yes. You're given if you apply for a gender recognition certificate and get one. You jump through those hoops, then you can apply for uh, a pretend birth certificate. It looks like a birth certificate. It didn't originally, I hasten to add. Originally, it had one column missing, so everyone would know. But eventually, government was persuaded to make it look like a natal birth certificate. So you get a pretend birth certificate that gives your real sex, but your natal birth certificate is still on record, and all of your trans history is subject to disclosure under a whole range of legal circumstances. So trans people in the UK are very much second-class citizens.
Definitely.
Mm.
Because in the US, it depends on the state you're in. Not all states allow you to do that either. Where I live in Michigan, you can do that. And my birth certificate was sealed, my old one. So it depends. Some places are more progressive than others. So it's
Mm.
really state to state. But I did want to ask you about one piece of history regarding, I think his name is Richard Green in the book. It talks about how being transgender got into the DSM, and Richard Green had mentioned, because sexuality was taken out, that this was basically a financial replacement. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, that was really quite shocking. So what's happening in the late 60s and early 70s is we have the gay liberation movement making a big headway and doing lots of things. And in the UK, we have the partial decriminalisation of gay men in 1967. And in particular, there's an increasing objection to being gay being classified as a mental illness. Now, in 1968, concurrently with this, in 1968, we have transsexualism as a term appearing in a list that's called the Index Medicus as a separate heading. And so suddenly we've got a separate category for trans people as transsexuals and appearing in a category of psychiatric illness in Index Medicus. Now, everything's going on in the gay rights world, I'm very pleased to say, and people are doing well. In particular, they're objecting to being listed as having mental illness. Transsexualism finds its way into the DSM in 1980 in the DSM-3. And according to Richard Green, who was part of the APA, this American Psychiatric Association's committee that were producing this and making these decisions, there was a big row about taking being gay out of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Registered Mental Illnesses, the list of psychiatric disorders that US medicine uses, US psychiatrists use it to claim against, for fee claims. You know, if it isn't in the DSM, then you're not going to get paid by your health insurance company, and that's it. Big argument about that, big row about that. Eventually it comes out, a thing called ego-dystonic homosexuality stays in. Ego-dystonic homosexuality is when you're gay, but you're unhappy about being gay. We'd probably call it homophobia, in fact. Anyway, according to Richard, and he had absolutely, no reason at all to lie about this. He said, well, after the big round in the bar afterwards, everyone was saying, well, it's all very well, isn't it? Taking it out, but, it leaves a gap. Some of us have got, kids to put through college, bills to pay. And Richard said, and someone else said, well, why don't you put transsexualism in instead of it? And Richard said, and everyone went high five, let's do it.
And here we are today with people, calling us mentally ill because of that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Because again, where's the evidence of mental illness? I mean, yes, of course, trans people may well experience higher levels of depression and isolation and so on, like any other marginalized and socially excluded group. But, depression is different from being trans, just as it's different from being gay. I mean, certainly if you were gay or lesbian in my generation in the 60s, you were likely to be pretty damn depressed because the only representations you ever saw of yourself were terribly negative. Yes, there were lots of representations, lots and lots of pulp lesbian fiction in particular. And, the only thing that ever ended happily was Patricia Highsmith's Carol. Well, Price of Salt as it was originally. Because everyone else, you end up miserable or dead or something awful happens to you, So, yeah, I just want to see the evidence that says that this is really mental illness. Well, we're not going to see that evidence. What we are going to see is a strong division in two streams of psychiatric thinking. And again, we can date that back to a guy called Ernest Jones in 1921, who sets up the British Institute, was it? The British Institute of Psychiatry? No, Psychoanalysis, rather. Let me just see if I can find the date here.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Anyway, it's around 1921 that Ernest Jones sets this up. He and he gets in touch actually with Freud, amongst others, and says, "Look, I've got someone who'd like to join the institute who's gay, a gay psychiatrist. What do you think?" And Freud actually says, "Well, that should be okay, more or less. I mean, it's a bit odd, but still, we shouldn't be thinking of homosexuality as being a mental illness." And Ernest Jones decides, no, it is a mental illness. Definitely. It's someone who is locked in the Oedipal state or some other kind of a state, and they've just never moved on. And then we have that whole stream of thinking being followed through, especially with object relations theory and so on. So that here we are today with two very distinct camps of thinking about trans mental health. One side, the kind of the Ernest Jones descendants, who are absolutely clear that it's a mental illness that's curable, and the other side, the ones ironically, who are the inheritors of Freud's, and for that matter, I guess Jung's broader view that no, it isn't. It's like being gay. We don't know why people are trans, just like we don't know why people are gay, just like we don't know why some people are left-handed. There's lots of things we don't know, but none of those are mental illnesses. And actually, what we can do is to give adequate support, as it were, the good guys say. But it's true that people are going through, because we're talking about still quite a high level of social exclusion, it's true that people are going through critical change, and therefore what we should do is to provide them with adequate counselling and therapeutic support as they make their decisions about their lives and their bodies to go through these changes, just as we do in every other area of medicine where people are experiencing extreme life change. Yeah. In, say, for example, pregnancy, very often, or in terminal illness, for example, or in and one of the oddities of medicine, it's a minority thing. It doesn't happen to many people at all, but it can happen, and nobody understands why. Sometimes a broken bone won't heal. It just won't. It doesn't matter what the orthopedic surgeon does to it, that leg will not heal, that arm will not heal. And it's at that point that liaison psychiatry, as the specialty is called, comes into its own, working with other specialties to support the patient in accommodating themselves to their new facts of life. And that's really where psychiatry and psychotherapy and counselling professions should be now, is in that liaison psychiatry role. Instead, we have this very vociferous Ernest Jones League, who are determined to make trans people mentally ill, even though, just like Ewan, trans people are apparently only floridly psychotic in one aspect of their lives. And even though in the UK in 2002, government formally stated that being trans wasn't a mental illness. Nevertheless, trans healthcare services are still located in mental health services in the UK.
Instead
And there's
of
no reason for this,
in
none at all.
medical,
Sorry?
sorry, like instead of being like a medical treatment.
Well, you'd put them in endocrinology, wouldn't you?
Right.
Endocrinology, yeah, because that's what it, endocrinology plus liaison psychiatry and elective surgery, reconstructive surgery for those who wish for it, because that's what works empirically. That's what gives us the highest, and it is a hugely high rate of success in medical terms. So in every, particularly in any medical intervention, really, I can't think of one where it isn't the case. No, I think in every medical intervention, although maybe one of your listeners will give me a whole list of things that are wrong, but I think just off the top of my head, in just about every medical case, there are people who regret it. There are people who wish they hadn't had the COVID jab, they wish that they hadn't taken the aspirin, and in some things, very common things like, say, prostate surgery, the regret rate is something like 40%. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I mean, we see the regret rate expressed very, very powerfully, actually, in people who decide to come off chemotherapy. Yeah. They regret having started chemotherapy, it makes them too ill. They don't want to. Okay, yes, there may be a chance that they'll live if they continue with it, but actually, they decide, it's their informed, consensual decision that they won't. They won't do that. And in the UK, we have places we call them Maggis centres, after a woman who founded them, for people who are terminally ill with cancer and who are living in that strange liminal waiting period. So they've got people they can go to and talk to and so on. So when we come to trans healthcare and we say, well, what's the regret rate like? And it looks to be, I mean, something like 1% maybe, extraordinarily low. And when we think of all the medical safeguards that we've got in position, certainly in the UK, you can't have reconstructive surgery, not on the NHS anyway, until you're 18 years old and an adult and able to give informed consent. Cross-sex hormones can't be prescribed until you're 16 years old. This is when we had a child and adolescent service that's been closed down and it hasn't been restarted yet. And in terms of so-called hormone blockers, the effects are pretty much reversible. And in any event, we have been prescribing them for cis children for decades, absolutely decades. And there's never been any concern. So there's the kind of pseudo-medicine that Ernest Jones and John Money and Richard Green recanted and actually became really helpful in the end, though he always did tend to run with the hare and hunt with the hounds. But he was a bit of a maverick, was Richard. But certainly the scholars and so on and the Ernest Jones crew, it's so out of date. And it's very disturbing. There's a report that's just been produced in the UK on trans and adolescent healthcare called the Cass report. Hailed, I think, by the New York Times and all sorts of people as very, very problematic. And if you get a chance, or your viewers get a chance, just put in Ruth Pierce, Pearce, into Google and Cass review problems. And Dr. Ruth Pierce has just collected together all of the criticism of the Cass review, which includes, big concerns from clinicians that effectively the methodology that was used was not just wholly inappropriate, but unethical, because they subjected it to what's called a double-blind randomized trial, the so-called gold standard. Well, there's lots of things that you can't ethically subject to a randomized trial. This is why trans kids' healthcare never have been. You can't say, okay, if we see a really difficult pregnancy, what we'll do is, to make sure that clinical interventions are effective, is we'll have one control group where we don't actually give them any care but we pretend to placebo, we give them placebo, and we'll see how they fare against the ones that we do care. Well, it's unethical to do that because it's very obvious. We'll take one bunch of broken legs and just pretend to have treated them, but we won't really. And we'll see how that fares against the ones that we do treat. I mean, there's multiple areas where so-called evidence-based medicine, the phrase has got such a wonderful thick and glitter about it, where so-called evidence-based medicine and the Cochrane system and the double-blind trial really tend not to work terribly well, or indeed to be wholly unethical. So we turn then to what works. Medicine always turns to what works. You try all the things that you know, and then when they don't work, you ask the question, what does? And that's what you go for. And if it works, it works. And we know what works for trans people because now we have, I guess, globally, hundreds of thousands of trans people who are saying, well, it worked for me. It was fine for me. No regret rate over here. Thank you. And then this tiny bunch of strange people motivated by, I'm not quite sure what, but some form of extremist view that produce this moral panic and massive accusations and misinformation and manufactured doubt. And all of that is, it's sexy stuff to print in newspapers. So it is like clickbait, isn't it? What it's called now. It's all clickbait. So yeah,
Yes.
again, all we can say is, well, let's just sit back then, since these people seem to be in full sway. Let's just sit back and ask ourselves, what does the evidence say? What does the statistics say? What does the lived experience of clinicians and trans people actually say before we start leaping ahead? Because otherwise, it begins to look very, very unpleasantly, as Susan Stryker put it in at a conference recently. As she said, it all feels very much like the Nuremberg laws.
It does, very much so. In fact, I started reading the book you recommended, Judith Butler's Who's Afraid of Gender?
Oh, yeah.
And it is like the phantasm of gender, as she puts it, this big scary thing. So I guess my last question for you is, well, I call it trans panic. Where do you see that going in the future? Do you think that's going to calm down or?
Well, it's now been, trans has now been heavily politicized in the UK and I guess just about everywhere else. And what we do know is that there is big, big money going into manufacturing trans panic. There's a really important report, a European Parliament report, published in 2021 called Tip of the Iceberg, which identifies $70 million of anti-gender funding coming from far-right groups, some political, some religious, to create trans panic and to erode women's rights. I think one of the big concerns everyone should have is that trans and trans panic is being used as a wedge issue for the larger issue of women's bodily rights. It's being used as a wedge issue to get at contraception and to get at elective termination and women's rights to self-determination. What do I think is going to happen? Well, I'm hopeful because what I see is this whole new generation of young trans people who are media savvy, who have been brought up just as, you're expected and hoped would happen in a world that was, until 5 years ago, relatively free of trans panic. So it means that they've grown up with healthcare and assumptions and a social identity and a legal status. was quite different from the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s. And that, after all, was the project of the previous generation of trans people, was to enable these young trans people to live in that way. I just don't think they're going to stand for it. I don't. I mean, there's hundreds of young trans scholars who are engaging in everywhere, in cultural theory, in medicine, in the law, just about everywhere, and who understand intersectionality automatically, who understand how these things happen, um, and who expect to be able to define themselves and not to have what are effectively a bunch of right-wing boomers telling them who they are. So I think that, the millennial and Gen Z and Gen A and all of these exciting, just lovely youngsters are going to change the world. We have been here before in LGBT history in the UK. We had in 1988, we had this thing called Section 28, where the government, the same party as is in government now, tried to ban the teaching of homosexuality as a pretended relationship in schools. We've had just the same pushback that we're getting now on trans rights. That was done in the 80s as a pushback on gay and lesbian rights. And it didn't work then. And I honestly don't believe it's going to work now. But it's not going to go away unless everybody understands that they have to act, and that this isn't just an issue for trans people. It's not just an issue for LGBTQIA plus people. It's an issue for everyone, because one of the reasons I wrote the book was to remind everyone, absolutely everyone, that rights you've taken as automatic for years can be removed from you in an instant. And it's a long, hard path to get them back.
Sure is. So we're gonna, I mean, I'm definitely in the camp of acting myself, and hopefully people that listen to this get some more history behind trans people, which is what I'm trying to do with this series. So I definitely appreciate having you on. It's been a great conversation. And before I sign off, just one more time, here's the Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes. Please go out and get it. Fascinating book, not just about Ewan. You go into a lot of history like you did today. So it's very enlightening. Having said that, thank you for coming on. I do really appreciate that.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
All right. You have a great day.
You too.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you.